We're going to spend a little time on the symptomology around PTSD. Um, the reason for it is fairly simple. There's going to be an expectation as a peer person that you know something about this, whether you are somebody who actually has PTS or you're just going to be someone who's exposed to it. There's just an expectation that you're going to be able to discuss this. So we're going to spend a little bit of time on the symptomology of PTSD and what it kind of looks like for the people who have it. And anytime you see D at the end of something, like PTSD or OCD or something like that, it just means that the intensity of the injury or illness is so great that it interferes with having a normal life. So we can try to increase the normalcy through understanding and support. And a lot of people that 30 years ago, if you got a PTSD diagnosis in the public safety sector, you were never going back to work. And even 20 years ago, if you were off for a month or something and came back to work, if you were a supervisor, you wouldn't be a supervisor anymore because you can't trust somebody who's had mental health issues. Come a long, long way. It's come a long, long way, but there's still work that needs doing, and that's part of your role as a peer supporter. Most everyone in this sector will experience some kind of post-traumatic stress. PTS is what we call the symptomology and the group of behaviors and responses that we have to that environment. You should expect it, it's normal. Those symptoms or those activities that we just discussed in the critical incident stress piece, those are all post-traumatic stress responses. It's normal, it's to be expected. Not encouraged necessarily, but to be expected. And it's also important to recognize that, just because people are exposed to trauma and they're exhibiting certain behaviors, it doesn't mean that PTSD is on the way. PTSD is a specific diagnosis that needs to be done by a mental health professional. All of the symptoms that we just saw in the critical incident stress stuff is found among people who have PTSD, but it is almost a separate field of study. And there's no guarantee that people who are exhibiting those behaviors at the beginning of the story have PTSD at the end. One of the best known symptoms of PTSD is intrusive imagery. This is different than the one that we just talked about the whole movie playing. This is where intrusive imageries will show up almost always at night in the form of nightmares. And sometimes we don't even know we're doing it. Our partners certainly do. The nightmare piece makes us wake up exhausted and soaking wet and with a fearful spouse beside us. It's one of the worst parts of it because we have the least amount of control. And what I found, when we talked about the substance stuff, and we spent a lot of time on day 2 on the substance stuff, is if you are someone who is having trouble sleeping and you're drinking, this is where the demons will arrive. And as I like to say, all demons can swim. There's no point trying to drown them. They can all swim. So the nightmares are usually just this sort of recurring unwanted memories of an event or a group of events that can morph into stories rather than the specific events. But people with PTS have nightmares. Another thing that we see is avoidance behaviors, which are largely adaptive but can be maladaptive, and that's when we try not to be places where we know there's going to be a problem. So for example, a combat vet who has PTSD will not attend a 1st of July or 4th of July party because they know there's going to be fireworks and they know they're going to have a problem with it. So, and if they by accident end up at a place where that happens, then those the shells go up in the air and they're in the dirt. Very common, very natural experience. The avoidance piece can be a little more insidious when it comes to social stuff. Because we try not to re-trigger ourselves. And one of the areas, I mentioned it before, one of the areas where people with PTS can have a real hard time is at weddings, because there's so much light, there's so much sound, there's so much smell. People get into your intimate space, the tables are all around, the floor vibrates with music. That can overwhelm people. So be aware if you're with somebody who suddenly has to flee at an event that seems joyful. That's mostly what's going on. But inside of this response, we can get some isolation and feelings of despair and lack of self-worth. That's when we need a more clinical approach to this thing, and mental health professionals to be involved. So and as a peer support person, we just want you to be aware that the avoidance piece and the intrusive energy pieces, they're very, very common. But as we mentioned before, you see those things in other behavioral health issues. So it doesn't necessarily mean that people are doing those things, who are doing those things automatically have PTS. It's not the case. And another thing we see in avoidance is memory issues and relationship issues. And here at Red Friday, we fully understand that the greatest casualty of PTSD is not a career or a workplace relationship or reputation. It's the intimate relationships in our home lives. So there's a trail of wreckage that PTSD has caused in families. It's one of the reasons at Red Friday that we train spouses of people with PTSD within peer support at no cost to the spouse, because we want people to know as much as they can about how to help themselves and others. So, and then we see some hyperarousal, where we're sort of always on guard and head on the swivel thing, and super reactive to anything going on around us. Tend to be in an agitated state, I guess we can call it that. And it takes very little to set people with PTS off. This is also where you'll see some anger and aggression. You'll see some senses of guilt and shame from things not going the way we had hoped. And inside of that fight module, you'll sometimes see some flight, and inside the flight will be some self-destructive behaviors. These are really only to be concerning if they're new behaviors, but the excessive drinking, that kind of stuff, those are part of that. So just to kind of watch for what we consider as destructive behaviors. Some of us are still riding motorcycles in our 60s, and our mothers hope we'd outgrow it. But it doesn't make it on its own an unhealthy endeavor. And then the other piece on the hyperarousal is very easily startled. People with PTS can kind of jump out of their skins real easily. My family knows not to come up behind me and start speaking to me. I react to that. Most of us will do. So those are all very common, very obvious symptoms of the prevalent workplace injury. Doesn't mean that's what you're going to deal with, and it's mostly for your own knowledge that we give you this module, because people expect you to know something about this. And PTSD is one of a number of occupational stress injuries, and generally the best industry language is OSI, because it encompasses the rest of it. And we don't want to exclude people from access to care or to the support that they need simply because they don't meet a diagnosis of PTSD. And the definition has changed over the last 25 years or so. So someone who might have been diagnosed then wouldn't be now, and someone who is now wouldn't be then. So it's kind of a fluid thing, and it's good that it changes, but the fact is that it can. So one of the things we see with PTSD is workplaces that have very high levels of stigma tend to have underrepresented PTSD numbers. When you think about that, that's not that surprising, because people won't come forward if they feel that they don't have the support in the workplace for their injury. And you should expect the behaviors that we've identified as being present and sometimes prevalent, but not all the time and all at the same time. And you're going to see these kind of behaviors with people who don't have PTS. And for the most part, you're going to deal with the biggest causes of disabilities in the workplace. Anxiety and depression together are the largest causes of workplace disability. And the depression piece is really kind of interesting, because they estimate between 10 and 15% of the public is clinically depressed. That number may be higher because of the stigma attached to it. But generally speaking, 10% of the people are taking an antidepressant. I take one. I'm glad I take it. It has, antidepressants are one of the areas of behavioral health work that have made real good progress, because they work. People are having much richer and fuller lives because of antidepressants. When we talk about anxiety levels are probably closer to 30%. We also see higher levels of anxiety in workplaces where there's a large female population. Another thing you're going to deal with is what we call concurrent disorders. Concurrent disorders are when someone has a diagnosable mental health issue that they are trying to treat themselves. And the most common that we see is depression and alcohol use disorder. So someone who is trying to take the sharper edges off their depressive feelings they're dosing with alcohol, which is a depressant. So you're not going to get success with that, but it's a very common attempt, and we see it all the time. And the other concurrent disorder we're seeing more and more of is schizophrenia and cannabis use. The cannabis that's available now is a whole different thing than the stuff from the 70s and can cause really strong reactions. But we're seeing more and more young people, especially young men, who are having schizophrenia that they're trying to treat themselves with cannabis. Something that we all are starting to be more aware of is a lot of behavioral health issues are bubble up and manifest in adolescence, but people don't get any treatment until they're in their 20s most of the time, and even then lots and lots of people don't get the help that they need. And you're going to see a lot of substance abuse and dependence. The kindness and generosity of spirit piece that we talked about earlier today with the braving stuff is, we always have to remember that nobody sets out to be an addict, and I've spent a lot of time around addicts, and what I found is that they all started out in some kind of pain, and whether it was physical, emotional, or spiritual, and they were just trying to take the sharp edges off it. Some people end up with an addiction because of a hobby that got away from them, but my experience, at least in the group of people that I've known, is it starts with pain. Something else that we don't really talk about that much is the amount of substance abuse in the public safety sector is much higher than reported. We have a lot of pain management going on with opiates, and we have a lot of alcohol use disorder. In fire, at least, the alcohol piece is somewhat cultural. It was always a very boisterous, manly, rah-rah kind of crowd, and the 24-hour shifts I find in the career jobs have actually helped to reduce the amount of obvious alcohol use disorder stuff, but it's a very common thing, and we need to be aware that it's not just something you can sit down beside somebody with and hope it's going to go away.